Hello boys and girls, friends old and new, welcome back to the channel. My name is Stian, and today we have this beat up old Waltham watch on the bench. It's not running, and looking at it, it's really in need of some tender love and care. We see that the hands can be set and the date changes as it should, so hopefully not too much wrong with the watch. But the case has certainly seen better days. Looks like the gold plating is starting to come off. And we see the crown is pretty badly worn as well. And I'm sure there's quite some dirt in the watch, but we'll see that in a second. So work to do. And we see the balance doesn't really want to turn. That's a bad sign. But it turns slightly, so maybe there's just some dirt blocking it. The dial actually looks pretty good. Dials are normally held in by screws, so we just loosen those screws and then we can take the dial off. And then we have the calendar works underneath. The calendar works is anything that helps change the date. We're going to take that off so we don't damage anything when we put the movement into the movement holder, especially the date disc we want to keep scratch free. But we're going to leave the keyless works, so the parts that have to do with the winding of the watch, we're going to leave those in place for now. So when we hear Waltham, we probably don't think of a watch like this. Probably more sort of envision a pocket watch made in the US, very nicely finished and so forth. Waltham was of course one of the big three in American watchmaking, and also the oldest one, founded in 1850 by a very influential watchmaker called Aaron Dennison. Dennison is a name you might have heard. Basically the most common watch cases we have nowadays. Water resistant are Dennison type cases with a screw on back and bezel and crown with gaskets. So that's Dennison's basic design. And Waltham was really big back in the day. They were a real pioneer of making interchangeable parts, even though that was quite difficult for quite a while, but they really changed the industry. They did succumb. Stories somewhat similar to Elgin and Hamilton in that sense. So they stopped making watches as, let's say, Waltham proper in 1957. And this watch is from the 1960s. So this is from their, let's call it the Swiss era. They were bought by a set of companies in Switzerland, including Invicta, and put out watches for a while after that even. We hope to be able to have a pocket watch from their, let's say, golden period at some point as well. Probably more representative of Waltham as such. Known for very nice finishing of their pocket watches. High-grade watches, absolutely. The movement in this one is an FHF 969. FHF is the reason ETA today says since 1793, because FHF was the factory from Fontaine-Moulon, established in that year, 1793, the oldest watch manufacturing company within the ETA group. Was merged into Bosch SI in the late 1920s with a bunch of other companies. But you still find quite a few of their movements around. Good quality movement, more workhorse than showroom queen, but good quality. And while talking about that, we managed to take apart most of their movement. Most of the time when we have a date on a movement, it's also an automatic. So It's fun as well, working on something a little bit less mainstream. There are some markings in the case back, but it has certainly been a while since this watch was last serviced. This is a pretty old mainspring. And it's also broken. This little piece here should be at the end. So without it, the mainspring just slips inside the barrel. So that might be the reason the watch didn't run. Let's peg all the jewel holes. Quite some dirt in some of them. We're also using this Eve Flex stick to clean the pivots. All right, let's get all the parts in the basket. Now we can let the cleaning machine do some work for us. Always nice. And while the machine is working, I have a question for you guys. Are zebras white with black stripes or black with white stripes? And yes, I know that seems like a very random question, but probably people who have watched a few of these videos wouldn't be too surprised by something random coming out of my mouth. But there is some method to the madness. Let's first take off the crystal of the old case. We're also going to take off some old hard grime and dirt from the case before putting it in the ultrasonic. We're also going to put the case back in the ultrasonic, and this old gasket is no longer any good. Quite stiff and easily snaps when we pull it a little bit. So let's get back to the question of the day. There actually is an answer to the zebra question, and apparently zebras are black with white stripes, as I'm sure some of you already knew or found out. The reason I ask that is that this is obviously a gold-plated case, right? I mean, the dial is brown, the dial has gold indices, the hands are golden, so obviously the case should be gold-plated as well. But looking under the microscope, it actually seems that what I thought was steel shining through is actually remnants of the old plating, which seems to have been nickel or chrome or something. Anyway, the first thing we need to do for doing anything about the case is taking the crown tube out. I have this nice little tool for that. And with the tube out of the case, we can start taking off the rest of the gold plating. Or that's at least what I thought I was doing. Now, as you saw, the case is rounded. There are no straight edges or sharp angles on the case. So I'm doing this freehand on this lapping machine. If you want sharp angles, of course, it's much better to use a jig, but we'll do that in a later video. But coming back to the case then, it seems very odd from a design point of view that you would have a chrome-plated or nickel-plated case with a dial that has, let's say, goldish motif with golden indices and hands and so forth. Typically, the indices and hands will be of the same color as the case. So the question really is what happened to the case. If anyone has any good ideas, then please tell me in the comments. What I'm doing here is using a polishing machine to take out the sharp angles that the lapping machine created, so that the angles of the case are not too much changed. That is, of course, always the risk when doing case work, that you're actually changing the shape of the case because you are removing material. After that, using this Scotch-Brite pad to put some graining on the case. This one will create a relatively fine grain. If you want a coarser grain, or of course other materials with a lower grit count for that. For the crown, I wanted to keep the crown. I'm not entirely sure if it is original, but I don't believe Waltham signed their crowns back in that time anyway. So we're gonna basically get off the plating or whatever was on it. And then we're gonna replate the crown together with the case. Got a pretty nifty setup for doing the plating. I'm scared of doing electric stuff, so I decided to dish out a little bit for having something that is basically on-off. And no, I'm not dipping in the restoration liquid there. We're first cleaning, electro-cleaning the case and the crown, basically to take off fat, fingerprints, that kind of thing. Now we're using something called a surface activator, and we're dipping the case and the crown into distilled water in between each of those baths. And then we're going to let it sit in the gold bath for about 15 minutes. Now 15 minutes is longer than typically used with these types of kits. The reason is that we want a bit thicker layer than what you would have on, for instance, a necklace or an earring. I'm sure there are people who bump their ears and their necks into door frames and stuff all the time, but most people would be more likely to do that with their watch. As a result of this longer time, we see that the case is a little bit dull. Don't worry, we're going to make it nice and shiny. Let's then take the parts out of the cleaning machine. One thing to note here is the different sizes of the capsules. One is really big and one is really small. Kind of like comparing a Norwegian to a Swede. And we know that when one of the capsules is bigger, either thicker or wider, that's the one that goes in on the balance. All right, let's put them in. See, it's a very basic finishing on the movement. It was a little bit the case with Elgin as well, as we discussed in that video, that they try to save costs by using, let's say, more entry-level Swiss movements, sometimes even French. But the balance oscillates nicely. Always good to see. So we're also going to put in a new mainspring. Don't actually have to grease the barrel with a new mainspring still in the bag. A little bit won't hurt. I'm not sure if it's the size of my head or what it is, but somehow I always seem to get some hair in the pictures. And I know you thought that was a setup for another Norwegian joke about sizes, but no, not this time. We're too big for that. And the eagle-eyed viewer might have seen that I'm back to my black finger cuts. Sort of goes better with the image of a watchmaker as a man of danger. Mostly in danger of hurting your knees when you're spending most of your time crawling around the floor trying to find a tiny little spring that you pinged away because you were an idiot and didn't use something to hold it down with, as a friend of mine did. We're using some Fixo Drop that keeps lubrication from spreading or creeping. Most important to use it on the pallet stones in the pallet fork. We also put it on the escape wheel. Ooh, the old slipperoo down into the right spot. Now that's how you assemble a watch like a boss. And we see this watch as the old way of implementing center seconds. Makes for a pretty thick movement, but that's how it was. And another one. Ooh. This watch also has the traditional way of setting lever screws, so we need to remember to put that one on before we put the barrel bridge on. And as you saw, there was very little play or wear in the barrel bridge for the barrel arbor. So that's one of the signs that this watch movement is actually a pretty good one. It also has a capstone for the escape wheel. And when you come across a movement that has a capstone like this, then do put that in before you put the train in. Otherwise, the escape wheel is not going to fit in the upper jewel hole in the train bridge. Always want to check multiple times to make sure that we don't screw down any bridges while a pivot is not properly in place. Especially nowadays, of course, when finding parts for these old watches is not easy at all. And they're going to cost quite a lot. Best place to find parts is eBay. And there are also some specialized groups, like Facebook groups, that kind of thing. And of course, material houses still have some parts for some old movements. Of course, one of the fascinating things about mechanical watches is that everything basically can be taken apart. So pretty much everything is screwed together, and things are held in place sometimes by friction. But sometimes you'll find screws that tighten counterclockwise or left-handed, like typically this screw here on the upper crown wheel. All right, we are going to put on the setting lever first. Since this one is screwed in, just hold it down with your finger. And there it's a really good tip to first unscrew the setting lever screw. So basically turn it the opposite way, and then you're going to feel that it clicks when it snaps into the grooves, and then you can tighten it. Can be quite fiddly or finicky. So the way I do services is to first put the base movement together. The base movement is what makes it tick, basically. Anything more than timekeeping is a complication. So the calendar on this one is a complication. And with the well-running base movement, we have also isolated any errors that we find later. All right, we're almost finished with the base movement. We just need to get the keyless works in so we can wind the watch. This is one of those places where I should use something to hold that spring down, not only while lubricating it. It's always better to use a probe or a piece of pegwood or something when there are parts that can ping off. Did I say can? I meant want to. All right, that looks good. And we're just going to put on this little plate that holds the minute wheel down. And then we can turn the watch over, put in the pallet fork, and we're going to lubricate it, and then put in the balance and test the watch. And when lubricating the pallet stones, we're putting a little bit of oil or grease on the exit pallet stone. That's the one we see in the picture here. And then we turn the pallet fork a little bit side to side so that we spread that oil evenly over the escape wheel teeth. And with that fix or drop that we saw before, the oil will stay pretty much in place for a much longer time. All right, moment of truth. And that looks pretty nice. If you have a really sharp eye, you might notice that the hairspring doesn't develop entirely concentrically. So that's also an indication of a little beat error problem. Gotta see how bad it is first before we do anything about it. We always demagnetize the movement before timing it. And right off the bat, it actually runs really well. So, well, kudos to FHF. Little bit of a beat error, so we take that out first. If you want to see how we do that on a watch like this, you can look up the memo sale chronograph video. And with a little bit of adjustments, we see the watch runs very nicely. All right, before putting in the calendar works, let's briefly clean the date disk a little bit. Not too much we can do about it, but maybe we get a little bit dirt off. Same thing with the dial. There is some dirt that is stuck too much in there, so we're not going to get that out without destroying the varnish. But the dial looks very nice as it is, so that's quite okay. It's a pretty straightforward calendar works. We're going to see how the semi-quick set works in a couple of minutes. The jumper and the jumper spring can be a little bit difficult to get in place. So there it is, a good idea and good practice to use a probe or something to help hold it down with. And then gently ease it into place with the date disk in place. Now there are a couple of these small cover plates that hold the date disk down that seem a little bit like afterthoughts. A bit like a band-aid after finding something didn't work, so not too elegant. Kind of psycho-ish. But hey, I'm a big fan of psycho, but you have these things there. And this one is what I'm talking about, along with its partner in crime on the other side. Now, one thing these old movements didn't have is a quick set for the date. This one has a semi-quick set where you turn the hand backwards. So let's look at how that works. You first turn the hands so that the date flips, and then you turn the hands backwards. And then you see the little spring-loaded lever there that slips over the tooth on the date disk and then allows you to turn the hands forward again. So that's a very common way of doing it on watches from the 1950s and 60s. All right, we can put the dial back on. Tighten the dial screws. Just make the date flip over so we know where the hour hand should be at midnight. And with the hour hand at the full hour, of course, the minute hand should be at 12 o'clock. And what we want to achieve is that the date changes over between 15 minutes to and 15 minutes after midnight. That is a pretty wide range, actually. So let's see if we manage to hit that. Should actually be able to get it to within about 5 minutes to and fro. So that looks just fine. Oh, what was that? Final check is to see that all the hands rotate freely and do not touch each other or the dial. Then let's look at the crystal. It was pretty banged up, so we're going to get a new one. Now I don't have one with a golden ring, so we're just going to swap them. Take the golden ring from the old one. And we're going to use our crystal press. That's something that is pretty much necessary when you have a tension ring crystal like this one. You have to press it gently into the case, and then it's going to stay there by force of friction. And that looks much better. We remember that we plated the crown, so we're going to put that one back on the stem. We're using something called Loctite. It's sort of a glue that makes the threading stick a little bit better. You can still get it off, but not by normal use. Last thing we're going to do is put in a new gasket for the case back. The biggest problem with old watches is the crown. That's where you're going to have the most water ingress. But we're going to put a new gasket anyway, of course. And with the case back in place, we just need to put on the strap, and then the watch is ready to wear. Let's have a look at a little bit then and now. And that's a pretty handsome watch on the wrist, I think. Quite a 60s, 70s design, but a handsome watch. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then sharing it on social media, clicking like and subscribe will really help the channel. We'll be back with more videos shortly. Until then, ta-ta.